What's up guys, I'm Ethan, your Real Life English fluency coach, and in today's lesson, I'm going to give you 8 different vocabulary learning recommendations that helped me a lot in learning 6 different languages, and also when I was teaching that my students found not only effective, but also a lot of fun. But before we get into the first tip, I want to let you know that if you're new here, every week we make lessons like this one to help you go beyond the classroom and live your English. So if you want to do that, it's really simple. Just hit that subscribe button and the bell down below so you don't miss any of our new lessons. Alright, so this is the number one thing that you need to start doing if you're not doing it already. Now, a spaced repetition system, or SRS, basically is technology that works along the same way that your memory does. So basically, when you learn a new word, in order for you to engrave it in your memory, you need to be reminded about it right away, within a minute. But as time passes, kind of the increments that you need to be reminded about this word in order to remember it get larger and larger. So for example, how a spaced repetition system will work along with the science of memory is that if you add a new word that you just learned to it, it's going to remind you about it in like 1 minute. But then after that, as long as you remembered it correctly, then it'll wait a little bit longer. It'll wait 10 minutes, and then it'll wait a day, and then 3 days, and then an entire week before showing it to you again. And in this way, you can really get to the point where you never forget new words and expressions that you learn. So I've used a lot of different SRS apps over the years, both personally and with my students, and so I'll recommend you a couple that you can try out and find which one works best for you. So the first 2 are really simple. They just work with that basic kind of technology and science that I told you about, and you can add images to them and sounds, but really you're just going to kind of add your vocabulary and expressions there and study them every day. So the first one is probably one of the most famous ones out there also, is called Anki. And actually on my iPhone nowadays, I use one called Flashcards Deluxe. Now, these 2 are very similar in functionalities, but the reason that I use Flashcard Deluxe on iPhone is because it is much cheaper. Anki has an app for iPhone, but it's very expensive, although it is free on Android. Alright, but maybe you want something a little bit more complex. So if that's the case, then you could try Memrise and Quizlet. Now, these, in addition to kind of that basic functionality that works with your memory, also include things like quizzes and different little games that help to not only increase your memorization, but they also make it more fun. Now, the really great thing about this is that you can download these apps on your phone and just use them anytime, anywhere. So for me, I really love to do this anytime that I have a few minutes that I'm waiting for someone, or if I'm at the doctor's office or at the bank or anywhere else where I have a couple minutes, I will just pop out my phone and I will start studying that new vocabulary that I have, or the old vocabulary that I have to review a little bit. And this is a really great way to make productive use of your time, and you'll just be remembering vocabulary like never before. Now, if you only follow this first recommendation, you are going to see a huge transformation in your ability to remember new vocabulary and expressions. But actually, it's really important that we talk about what exactly are the words and expressions that you should be filling your SRS app with. So I've met a lot of English learners who think that they have to know everything. They learn a lot of advanced, really obscure vocabulary because they think that it'll make their English sound like it's at a higher level. But really, natives do not speak like this. They don't really use these kind of words. Why, my good confidant, I had pondered that it could be an ebullient noontide if we sauntered down to the babbling brook and noshed on some sustenance. Now, obviously that's an exaggeration, but seriously, I've met so many English learners out there who try to use really complex vocabulary that natives never use. Or they just try to use expressions and idioms in every single sentence, and it can make them sound really unnatural. And if you actually start paying attention to the way that you speak in your own native language, you probably don't do this either. So why would you do it in English? Now, it depends what study you look at, but English only has about 3,000 words that natives use in 95% of their speaking. And this is a really tiny number when you consider that English has hundreds of thousands of words. And this is really true in any language. So the good news here is that unless you want to study English literature, you really do not need to have a huge vocabulary base. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't consistently be learning vocabulary and expressions, even if you're an advanced English learner, but it does mean that maybe the amount of vocabulary that you need to be fluent isn't as much as you think. And actually, we did a lesson on 5 myths about English fluency, and if you haven't seen that yet, then I really highly recommend that you watch it next. But the point here is that your English will not sound more fluent by using more complex vocabulary. And in fact, if you're not using this kind of vocabulary tactfully, it could actually make you sound less fluent because it's obvious that you're trying too hard. And furthermore, most English is used between non-natives. For example, when you're in a business setting, usually a meeting could be in English between someone from the United States and someone from Germany and someone from Brazil and someone from Japan. And if you're traveling, this is also the case. So if you're using really complex vocabulary, then other English learners like yourself probably won't really understand you. And really, the goal is to be able to communicate and to be understood. But you're probably still asking yourself, what are the 3,000 words that I actually need to learn in order to be fluent in English? Now, of course, you could just go onto Google and type in the most common words in English, and you could get a list that will have a lot of words that people use every day speaking in English, and that might be useful for you. But really, a lot of these words you probably already know, the most essential ones anyway, and a lot of what you're going to have to learn is going to be personal to you. So for example, you could think about what are the things that you usually spend your time doing every day? What kind of hobbies do you have? So I could give you an example actually using myself. Right now, I'm actually taking classes for singing in Spanish. And so a lot of the vocabulary that I have to learn has to do with singing. But this would be really useless probably for most Spanish learners. And another thing that you probably need to think about is your work. So do you work in a business setting? Maybe you need to learn more business English, or maybe you work in science and you need scientific vocabulary, or you work in law, or so on. So basically the point here is that I want you to change your mindset about vocabulary learning. So it doesn't have to do with just memorizing tons of words. Each and every one of our lives are different, and our vocabulary base needs to reflect those differences and the uniqueness of our life. Now, just a disclaimer before I move on, I am mostly talking about active vocabulary up to this point. Now, active vocabulary is the vocabulary that you can actually think of and use. Passive vocabulary, on the other hand, is the vocabulary that you'll understand, but you can't necessarily recall it when you're in conversation or writing. And our passive vocabulary is always much larger than our active vocabulary. This is true whether you're a native or whether you're a learner. Alright, so now let's talk more about the best way to increase your active and passive vocabulary in English. So it is super important that you are constantly doing things that you enjoy in English, because you will naturally expose yourself to the vocabulary that you need. Now, watching TV series is one great way to do this. With shows like Friends, for example, you get exposed to everyday situations, so you learn the vocabulary that you need in daily life. Now, podcasts are another really great way to exercise both your active and passive vocabulary. A great place to start is with our own RealLife English podcast. And you can also sign up for Power Learning Week. Now, in this free 3-part mini course, you will actually learn the vocabulary that natives use in everyday life. And this will help you so much to understand and speak better. So you can learn more and sign up by clicking up here or down in the description below. As I mentioned before, it's useful to reflect on what you work in, and then you can listen to a TV series or podcast that will help you to get the vocabulary related to that you need. So for example, if you're a lawyer, you could watch a show like Suits. If you work in technology, you could watch Silicon Valley. And if you want to learn more things like this that will help you to improve your communication, then for sure check out this lesson where I talk about things that you can do every day to improve your English. And in addition to the spaced repetition systems we talked about in the beginning, you should definitely start keeping a word journal as well. Now, this could actually be physically paper that you keep in your pocket, or you could actually use any sort of notepad app on your phone that you'll have access to wherever you are. So anytime you read something, or you watch something, or you listen to something, then you find a new word, you can note it down in your word journal before you actually add it to the app that you're using for spaced repetition. Reading is actually probably the best way to expand your vocabulary, so if you're reading a book or a newspaper or anything else, what I actually recommend is not looking up everything in the moment, but actually highlight things and then later go add them to your word journal and finally to a spaced repetition system so you'll never forget them. Now, the more that you do this, the more that you will be able to understand new vocabulary through the context without even looking it up in a dictionary. It will naturally be added to your passive and even your active vocabulary. Now, this recommendation is short, but it's also probably one of the hardest to do. Now, you need to avoid just memorizing a translation from your native language. And this will also help you to cultivate actually starting to think in English. Now, if you don't do this, then you're always going to be having to think first in your language how you say that word, and then translating it in your head to English. and this will really slow your speaking. Now, when you encounter a new word in English, don't just head over to Google Translate. Actually look it up in an English-speaking dictionary. And when you add it to your word journal or SRS, then be sure to also put the definition in English. Don't use your language at all if you can avoid it. And this will help you to break the bad habit of translating first in your mind, and it will help you to start cultivating the good habit of thinking in English. So have you ever really thought about what kind of learner you are? So I'm going to go through some different types, and I want you to actually use this time to reflect on which type of learner you believe you are. And it can be really helpful to think of past experiences in learning where you have learned in a really effective way, and basically use that to try to determine this. So first of all, maybe you have a photographic memory, and as soon as you see a word, you remember it. But I'm guessing if that's the case, you probably would not need to watch this video. So the next one is, if you're like me, you're a visual learner. This means that you have to actually see things to remember them. Now for me, I noticed that I remember things a lot by where I was when I learned it, or what exactly I was doing. So for example, I can remember something that I heard in a podcast by what activity that I was doing and where I was at. So maybe I was running and I was in a specific location, and I'll actually remember about that information along with the information that I learned. Now, maybe it's not always effective to put yourself in some location that you really remember, so you can do other things. For example, with your spaced repetition system to a certain flashcard, you could actually add an illustration, maybe one that you drew, or a picture of something. So just to give you an example of how I've done this in the past, one word that I learned in Catalan was am xifla. And this means that you're crazy about something, that you absolutely love something. So I actually learned this because someone was telling me that a certain sandwich shop here in Barcelona is something that they're crazy about. So I actually used the logo of that sandwich shop on my flashcard for that term, am xifla, and it helped me a ton to remember that and to add it to my active vocabulary. So next, maybe you're an oral learner. This means that you use your ears to remember things. So maybe you actually need to hear a word in order to remember it. And if this is the case for you, then it's really important that you add sound to your spaced repetition system. Now, this could just be a sound that actually reminds you of the word, or it could be the pronunciation of the word itself. And of course, if this is the case for you, then anytime you learn a new word, it's really important that you, for example, go to Google and type in the word plus pronunciation. And if you do this, then it will actually bring up an audio file of the pronunciation of the word. You could also use a website like forvo.com where you'll find natives pronouncing different words. And something else you might find super effective, if this is the case for you, is to learn English with music. So finally, we have kinesthetic learners. Now, this is actually the rarest type. And this means that you learn with movement. So it might help you in your learning and thinking if you're standing up or even moving around. And for kinesthetic learners, tactile activities can be really effective too. So you might actually want to find something physical that represents the word that you're learning and actually even touch it and play around with it with your hands. All right, so for this next tip, we're going to use associations. So first of all, you could visualize something in your head. And maybe this wouldn't even necessarily have anything to do with the word. It's just something that helps you to remember it in a really visual way. Now, if you are a visual learner, then it's going to be very helpful. So just to give you an example, you could, for example, be learning the word buzz, which is the feeling that you get right after you drink a coffee. And you might actually remember that the word buzz is also the sound that a bee makes. So that bzzz sound we also call buzz. So maybe to help yourself remember this in a really silly way, you could imagine a bee drinking a coffee. Now, something else that you could try is actually drawing a picture yourself, not just looking up one online. This will actually help to make it more fun and relaxing while you're actively learning vocabulary. And while it's not good to just translate words into English, it can be very effective to think of a word in your own language that sounds like the word that you're learning in English. So just to give you an example, say that you are a Spanish speaker learning English and you want to learn the word to run, actually the affinitive verb to run, and you might actually think, well, in Spanish that sounds a lot like the dessert that we have at Christmas, which is called turrón. So now every time you try to think of the word to run, you're just going to think about the dessert. Or maybe again, if you're very visual, you might actually think about someone running and eating some turrón. And that actually brings us to our next tip. So as soon as possible after you learn a new word or expression, you should actually be writing it or speaking it. So in the next conversation that you get into, see if there's some way that you can sneak in that new expression or that new word that you just learned. But maybe you have no one to speak to. So what you can do in that case is you can create actual example sentences. You can do this by writing them down in your journal. You can do this by actually thinking of some sentence and recording it and listening back and correcting your mistakes. Or just think about them in your head if you don't have a pen or a recorder handy. Now, I actually had a student a few years back who had a really long commute to work, and he would actually take advantage of this time by speaking to himself in the car about various subjects. And this was a great way to sneak in some vocabulary practice of words that he had recently learned. So something that you could actually try is thinking up a story with 5 words that you learned in English yesterday. So expanding your active vocabulary is really challenging, and I think that the recommendations I gave you today will help you a lot on your journey to reach English fluency, to be able to have the words that you need. But when you forget a word, don't let it get you stressed out. What you should do in these instances, instead of just going blank or trying to translate from your own language, is trying to find a different way that you can describe it. Because this is really the essence of fluency. It's not that you have every single word for every situation, or that you can speak exactly like a native. Natives, in fact, forget words too. Fluency is about that you're able to flow with the language. So when you forget a word, you are able to say it in a different way. You're able to explain what you want to say so that the conversation doesn't get interrupted. So if you start practicing doing this, you're going to just notice a huge transformation in your ability to be fluent in English. You will feel more confident because you'll know that you'll always have some way to describe what you want to say. And if you don't, you can just laugh it off and you can know that you have to look up that word when you get home. And as I've told you in this video, you can lower the bar. You don't need to know every single word. As I mentioned before, there's only about 3,000 that you'll need to be confident and fluent in your daily conversations. So really what's essential here is that you actually develop a habit that you're learning at least a few words every day and that you are using them whenever possible. So I hope you found this video very useful. I would love to hear if you have any other tips out there for English learners like you. Write them down in the comments below so we can all learn together. And now it's time to go beyond the classroom and live your English. Aw, yeah.
What's up, everyone? I'm Andrea, your real life English fluency coach. And today we have a great lesson for you to help you become more confident when speaking in English.